Hey, everybody, we're going to give all the attendees just a few minutes to trickle in, and we'll kick off our Belmont Parks, Recreation, Open Space Master Plan Advisory Committee meeting number 5. We've slowly still got some people coming in, so I just want to give them a minute or two more and we'll get started. We've been hovering at about 20 attendees since I last said we're waiting. So Bridget, do you want to kick us off?
All right. Good evening, everybody. This is our 5th advisory committee meeting. And first of all, thank you all for attending, general public, advisory committee, and our consultants and city staff as well. For those of you that are new to this venue, I'm Bridget Shearer, Parks and Recreation Director for the City of Belmont, and have been working with an awesome team of staff and consultants and advisory committee to help develop our Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Master Plan. Tonight, we're going to be talking primarily about open space, and I'm going to hand off without further ado to directly to John Boss from WRA to talk to us about the progress that's been made so far, and seek some feedback and comments from the advisory committee, followed by some public comments towards the end of the meeting. So without further ado, here's John.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, everybody. So I'm the project manager for the WRA consultant team. Next slide, please, Robin. So tonight we're going to update on a couple items. We're going to talk about the environmental assessment, what we call the base plan, and 2 management alternatives. And we're going to talk about implementation actions and requirements associated with the base plan and each management alternative. Then we'll follow with next steps on what's going to come after tonight's meeting. I'll be given the first part of the presentation, then Dr. Brian Kearns, who's our senior wildlife biologist, will talk about the environmental assessment. Robin Graham's going to talk a little bit about the in progress but almost done recreation use assessment, and then I'll close with a discussion on the base plan, the management alternatives, the implementation actions. And then in addition to going through our routine PowerPoint deck tonight, we're going to try to be a little bit more engaging, and we're going to pose some survey questions to our audience, to our participants, and we'll be able to see those results in real time. So Dana, if you want to queue up that first question, we're ready to roll. So the question is, how frequently do you visit Belmont's open spaces? So take a few seconds there to vote, and then we'll see the results here shortly. Go. That's instantaneous feedback. So it looks like about half our respondents, a little bit more, go weekly, 1/4 go daily, and about 1/5, 21% go once a month. So that's good. People value the open space.
Hey, John, sorry to interrupt. Is this poll open to panelists plus participants or just
It is.
panelists?
It
Okay.
is. Yes, it is. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Next slide, please. So again, just taking a step back before we get into the details of those other topics I just mentioned, what adoption of the open space management plan will allow the city to do is basically augment existing goals and policies that pertain to management of open space and basically commit to specific implementation actions that may require funding, possible environmental compliance and permitting requirements. Next slide, please. So early on in the process, we talked about different issues that we're hearing from the public, various issues that we had identified in reviewing the different planning documents that the city gave WRA when we started this process. And so we identified key issues into three major categories: environmental sustainability, balanced recreation uses and trail management, and natural hazard mitigation. So we have another question for you about what you value in respect to these three issues. So basically, as I said, the plan's organized around three themes: environmental sustainability, balanced recreation use and trail management, and natural hazard mitigation. So which of these is the most important to you? Just a single choice is allowed. So go ahead and vote, please. We have results. So about 80% plus picked number 2, balanced recreation uses and trail management. Pretty small percentage picked natural hazard mitigation, and then 15% picked environmental sustainability. All right, great. Next slide, please. So this is just a map showing the two study areas. Our study areas are San Juan Canyon, seen here on the left of the slide, and then Water Dog Lake open space area towards sort of the bottom right of the slide. And just did want to point out Hidden Canyon Park, which is adjacent to the open space area, is just adjacent to it. It's not part of the open space management plan. It fits in with another planning effort, but not the open space management plan. The next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk about all the different documents and how we've been taking, input and basically feeding it in to the base plan and the management alternatives. We started out early in the process looking at the city's general plan, and particularly the park and recreation and conservation elements. We also spent a fair amount of time looking at the county's hazard mitigation plan, and we looked at other city documents as well. And we also relied on outside sources of information that we considered highly relevant to this planning effort: the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District's resource management policies and the Marin County's road and management trail plan. Then as we got more focused on getting ready to go in the field, we looked at the California Natural Diversity Database. Brian will probably have a few things to say about that shortly. We looked at various peer review literature on effects or potential effects of recreation use on biological resources. During that same time, we're always looking at community input. That was sort of has been an ongoing process. We're looking at emails and written comments that community members have provided, and a fair amount of other information, other documents came into that process. So we've looked at all that information and considered that as we develop these key deliverables. So we've been working mostly on the environmental assessment. I mean, the environment for the open space areas is basically the recreation resource, if you will. It's what allows recreation to occur, to be sustainable. So we have spent more time on that, but the recreation use assessment is almost done. It's going to be forthcoming. It'll be released and it'll go live, I think, next Monday. So we're very close on that. And Robin will have a few things to say about it, just to sort of whet your appetite for what's coming later. And then ultimately, we've taken the findings in the environmental assessment, the recreation use assessment, and we have fed those into the base plan and the management alternatives. So that's what I'm going to be talking about toward the end of the presentation. And I want to also make clear that when we talk about recreation on the open space areas, we're talking about passive recreation, which basically refers to activities that are not facility dependent. There are things like wildlife viewing, hiking, biking, could be equestrian use, could be other forms of nature study. So we're really talking about passive recreation use of the open space areas. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just the hit parade, if you will, of the documents that we've looked at. We actually submitted a deliverable to the city outlining the parts of these documents that we've used or have found useful in developing our subsequent deliverables, including the management alternatives and the base plan. Next slide, please. So in looking at those planning documents that the city provided and public comment and all the initial sources of information we received, we found a couple areas where we thought there were policy gaps that should be addressed in the open space management plan. So those fell into 5 categories: protection of riparian resources and water resources more generally, adaptive management, monitoring, trail closures and or rerouting, trail maintenance, and what to do about e-bikes. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pause here for a few minutes, and Brian Kearns is going to walk us through the environmental assessment. It's all yours for a little while, Brian.
All right, thanks, John. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Brian Kearns. I'm a wildlife biologist, also with WRA Environmental. And I was one of the couple of folks who was lucky enough to get to walk all your trails and do this environmental assessment and get to know beautiful Belmont a little better. So just some general facts about the environmental assessment. So what it is and is not. The environmental assessment, it's a large-scale master planning level study to support development of goals, policies, and implementation actions. So basically trying to gather, general information to support, decision making. And the field work involved in this is fairly limited, and it's designed to identify, major environmental concerns that will require, more detailed field-based evaluations down the line. Just, to kind of emphasize that point. Something this is not is a research project or a complete comprehensive vegetation survey of the entire open space areas, or any kind of protocol level or very serious and focused wildlife survey to verify the presence of particular common or sensitive wildlife species. We're trying to identify habitats and potential habitats for those species as we go along. Next slide, please, Robin. So the components of the environmental assessment were to do a desktop review and a field assessment, both kind of in conjunction with each other, to look at common and sensitive plant species as well as common and sensitive wildlife species, and then also to look at vegetation communities across these 2 open spaces and compare those against existing data. And then also, as we were traversing these areas, looking at habitat to assess trail conditions and areas that may be problematic and what the trails are looking like at the present time. Next slide, please. The desktop review piece was our first step. As John mentioned, we looked at the California Natural Diversity Database, and that's put out by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and it catalogs many special status species as well as some common species. Observations can be submitted by various people, but it's a great resource to kind of get a sense of what animals may be occurring where. We also utilized the Fish and Wildlife Services, at the Federal Fish and Wildlife Services information for planning and conservation system. That data is mainly concerned with federally listed, so federally endangered or threatened species that have gone through that process and are protected and potentially have special habitat areas set aside. We also looked at the California Native Plant Society's inventory records, which gives us, it's a similar resource to the CNDDB, but more focused on plants and a little more comprehensive in that regard. So they play nicely together and complement each other well. We also looked at species of special concern and where those occurrences have been documented. And then lastly, sort of in comparison to the other Fish and Wildlife Service database, the information for planning and conservation, looked at the critical habitat mapper, which shows, if very particular habitat areas have been designated for listed species. Aren't the background noise there, but next slide. And the field assessment of environmental conditions was conducted in both parks. The point being to basically, ground truth all the data we found during the desktop assessment. So we wanted to verify in the field what the vegetation communities looked like and compare those against San Mateo County's data, which we'll see in a couple slides here and how that looked. Also to actually walk the bulk of the trails within the open spaces and look at the condition of the trails, and based on a few different factors, which I'll get into in a few moments as well. Also, we were trying to, as we went, look at habitat and any potential occurrences we found of common or special status species, and look at if the conditions within the open spaces do provide suitable habitat for special status species, and whether that might be a consideration for any kind of action taken within the open spaces. And then, of course, to assess baseline conditions of vegetation and wildlife habitat, and like I said, as we go, sort of to note any common wildlife and plant species observed. But again, this is sort of an incidental piece of this. We're really looking at a more habitat level assessment for where species could occur, knowing what we know as experts in the region about plants and wildlife. Next slide, Ron. Thanks. So the field work for this, as I said, two WRA staff performed this. It was myself and another biologist more focused on the botanical aspect. So we kind of covered both of those gamuts. And we were fortunate enough, as I said, to walk about 10 miles of the existing trails during March. So during an active time for animals, and during a great, beautiful time to be out in the hills there. Next slide, please. So going through the vegetation, we were mainly looking at what the composition of the vegetation looked like. So from the trails, chiefly, because of the sort of survey level that we were doing, and looking at what the quality looked like. So high quality, mostly intact, moderate quality, thinking it would be moderately altered when we observed it, low quality, or low quality, extensively altered. So areas that are heavily impacted, obviously least impacted to most impacted. You can go to the next slide. And also to verify what the communities looked like. So this is a map of Water Dog Lake open space area here, and you can see that most of the vegetation communities are dominated by these two communities. One is coastal live oak forest, and the other is chamise. That's the coastal live oak is the sort of dark green that dominates the western portion of the park, and the darker red to the east is the chamise area. If we go to the next slide, we can get an example of those two communities. So those may look familiar if you frequent the park there, but these are pretty representative of the bulk of the vegetation communities within the park. And my assessment, having been out there, is that the bulk of these vegetation communities are in fairly good conditions. That was great to see. Next slide, please. So similarly, looking at San Juan Canyon open space, this is a slightly different setup here, but again, coastal live oak played a really dominant role in the vegetation communities here, but that chamise community was less present and was more or less replaced by coyote brush. So if we go to the next slide, we can see examples of that in San Juan Canyon as well. So again, sort of a scrubby, shorter, height vegetation community versus a nice coast live oak forest. I can go to the next slide. So and then in addition, of course, to looking at the habitat conditions, we were assessing trail condition indicators. So looking at trail erosion was sort of our main indicator. Also the presence of multiple or braided trails. So where there were sort of multiple lines, if you will, down the trail where one line could have sufficed. Presence of any unofficial trails, and then also stream crossings wherever those occurred, regardless of the condition or any infrastructure that had been installed over the stream. And at the bottom here, you can see examples of sort of how we classified trail conditions. So on the left is low erosion. So maybe we see some amount of erosion in the center of the trail where perhaps water ran or something like that. Medium is there in the middle. We have a bit of actual sort of more pronounced erosion. And then on the right is high, where we have multiple channels of pretty extreme erosion, steep slope, etc. Next slide's fine. So this sort of demonstrates, the distribution of different types of erosion throughout both open spaces. So within Water Dog Lake, it's actually pretty heartening to see that there very few instances of high erosion in both open spaces. There's definitely the lowest category. Most of the erosion we observed was in that low erosion category. So some level of erosion occurring, but nothing extremely drastic. San Juan Canyon open space, perhaps just because of its size in part, had much less erosion, but overall the trails are in fairly good condition, with a few sort of problematic areas, let's put it that way. Next slide, please. So generally speaking, trail density findings, both by observing what we did observe during the field work and sort of digesting that information after the fact, it's our opinion the trail density is not having an effect on other environmental indicators, such as the presence of common wildlife species or their movements, the presence of special status wildlife species, which I'll try to quickly address here in a few moments. Habitat conditions seem generally very good, and based on our observations, and carnivore movements as well seem unlikely to be hindered by the presence of these relatively small trails, given the overall quality of the habitat within these open spaces. Next slide, please. So we did identify a few sensitive wildlife species that do have some potential to occur within the open spaces. So several of these are bird species, so olive-sided flycatcher, white-tailed kite, common yellowthroat. These species are all species that would use these oak forests or some of the riparian areas near water bodies to forage and breed. So those would be something to consider. The hoary bat's also a species that can use riparian areas to form roosts. The badger is also sort of a species that's present in grasslands throughout the peninsula, and although there aren't a tremendous number of grasslands in the area, it's something to consider. And then in Water Dog Lake itself, we did observe some turtles, and usually, although we couldn't identify exactly which species because they often like to dive out of the way really quickly before you can actually get a good look at them. Often where turtles occur, there's some potential for the native western pond turtle to occur, which is protected. Next slide, please. We did, if you've been out to either of these sites, I'm sure you've seen these piles of sticks. There certainly are San Francisco dusky-footed wood rat present, and that is a protected species. And then we also found some western leatherwood, which is another protected species. Next slide, please. So the baseline conditions and the findings that we sort of have a takeaway from this are most of the vegetation is in very good condition, which is really heartening to see. There obviously is some localized impacts where the trail use occurs, but where vegetation is natural, it's in good shape. In general, most of the species that sort of may regionally occur that are sensitive or special status plant and wildlife species probably have a fairly low potential to occur, to use these open spaces as a critical piece of their life. And again, these species were identified during desktop review, and then we considered, based on the habitat we saw, whether or not there'd be a likelihood for them to be there. We also don't really believe that recreation use is generally having an impact on the environment, with the exception of the fact that some of the trails do go directly through stream channels that are not protected via bridges or other infrastructure that might stabilize the stream channel and prevent erosion. So that's certainly something that's being considered currently. And yeah, definitely both open spaces do contain areas where bobcats or mountain lions may move, and that's something we need to consider as well. Next slide. Just real quick, because I know I'm pushing on my time limit here, but I just wanted to point out that we did have quite a nice suite of species seen there. So lots of birds, a couple of mammals and reptiles even, and observed habitat for some of these larger species that are known to occur in the area, such as mountain lion and bobcat. And then I think on the next slide, we show a few of the many plant species that we identified out there in the vegetation communities. So just to wrap up this section here, the critical and possible recommendations we have here. Critical is definitely to address severe erosion areas. Again, they're relatively uncommon compared to the bulk of the trails, but they do exist and they should be addressed. And then also connected that to protect the stream crossings or reroute the trails around stream crossings to avoid those areas. And then there's potential further assessments that we could do to determine the disposition of trails and look at the appropriate management actions. So whether to maintain the trails as is, reconstruct the current trails and the exact location based on the hydrology of the area, construct a new segment along the same general route, reroute the entire trail, and then also to consider closures seasonally or permanently. So I think that's all it for me. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Brian.
This next section, sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I'm Robin Graham. I'm an open space planner for WRA. And I'll walk us through a brief overview of the recreation use assessment. As John said, it's forthcoming. We're doing our internal reviews, and we're excited to release it to the city and to the public. So again, we did a desktop review for the recreation use assessment, noting potential safety issues, reviewing local and regional trends, kind of looking at benchmarks for other open spaces in the peninsula and in the region. And we wanted to consider opportunities to improve experiences for the visitors at Belmont's open spaces. In addition to our desktop review, we were in the field for another 2 days of field assessments, looking at the trails there.
And I think we have another survey question for our audience before you jump ahead.
Yes.
So I'll let you narrate that, Phil.
Thank you. Yeah, so if you guys wouldn't mind participating in our next poll, what type of time of day do you prefer to visit Belmont's open space? I know what I would say. Oh, so we've got the results here, and we've got a pretty even distribution almost. About 40% of you guys said you like to go in the morning, another 40% you like to go in the afternoon, and about 20% said they like to go midday. And I think that's pretty common kind of on trail systems throughout the area. That's good to know. So just without going into too much detail before we kind of really finalize this document, just some of the findings from that desktop review and from the field assessment, we found that quite a few trail segments didn't have adequate wayfinding. And as everybody knows, there's some trails that are on the maps and some trails that are not on the maps, and so that was kind of feeding into the signage issue. In addition, Brian talked about this, some trail segments were not sustainably aligned or sustainably constructed. But there's definitely areas where we think that visitor experiences can be enhanced and people can enjoy these places more. So some of our recommendations based on those findings were, adopting trail construction standards. And so we've provided some really great examples from California state parks and other areas that have really good trail construction handbooks from which we can draw. Another recommendation is to consider single use and single direction trail segments to enhance visitor experiences and increase a sense of safety in some places and just allow people to have some unique experiences. And then another potential recommendation is to measure recreation use and survey non-visitors. That gives us a way to evaluate management actions and evaluate visitor experiences. Because we get good feedback, when we're doing these planning processes, and it's helpful to get feedback as we move forward as well. So I'll pass it back to John.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Rob. So I just wanted to touch on wildfire a little bit, then I'll go into management alternatives and the base plan. So just wanted to acknowledge that CAL FIRE does rate the city's 2 open space areas as very high and high hazard for Water Dog Lake and San Juan Canyon. But the majority of the vegetation in these areas is basically ranked low hazard in terms of its ability to burn and carry a fire. It has low ignition potential. What's really driving the high and very high ratings from CAL FIRE is the fact that a lot of that vegetation is on steep slopes, and the fact that a lot of it's in proximity to residences, as you can see here in the photo below. So many of the lands, many of the lands are adjacent to residential areas. The city has been fairly active though in doing fuel reduction activities. I guess the other thing I'll add is if there's any kind of vegetation removal for noxious weeds or for reduction of fuels, we would revegetate those with native plantings. So just wanted to touch on the wildland fire issue just a bit. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the base plan and the management alternatives. Next slide, please. So we have a base plan that we've been constructing that is a set of objectives and policies and implementation actions. We added objectives and policies based on WRA's expertise and experience doing these kinds of plans for other jurisdictions. We also took some of our ideas, some of the content from looking at the original city planning documents that we were given when we started this project. Also, I just want to point out that all the objectives and policies that come from the city's general plan, the park and recreation and the conservation elements, all of those are incorporated by reference. We're going to flip over to the plan alternatives document here in a minute. It does not have all those objectives and policies from the city's general plan, but they are incorporated by reference. I just want to be very clear about that. So we have a base plan. We built it to be fairly robust. And then we have created 2 management alternatives that, in addition to everything that would be in the base plan, would add an additional recreation policy for a recreation emphasis type alternative, and then would add additional habitat protection and restoration policies and implementation actions for a habitat focused alternative. So those are really our 3 options. Next slide, please. So we have objectives that cover these 9 different categories. The first 3 are really sort of the driving issues of the plan, but we also wanted to make sure we had objectives in there for vegetation protection, wildlife protection, water resource protection. We also felt it was important to have something on adaptive management and also just capability for the city to be able to implement the various implementation actions that are affiliated with the base plan and the 2 management alternatives. Next slide, please. So the base plan includes 39 new policies. Again, that's in addition to what's in the city's general plan, conservation and parks and recreation elements. It has 28 implementation actions. And here's just a few representative actions that I've listed below here. And bear in mind that the implementation actions are really going to be the most tangible, observable things, quantifiable things that you'll see on the ground that you would notice a difference after they're done on the open space areas. Next slide, please. So then the recreation emphasis alternative, it has 1 additional policy to evaluate new trails. That's a bit of an oversimplification. There's some more nuance to it than that, and I can talk about that during question and answers. There are 3 additional implementation actions that come with this alternative in addition to what's in the base plan. And I also want to point out that for the 3rd implementation action here, when we talk about new nature-based recreation programming, we are talking about passive recreation. We're not talking about environmental impacting recreation that's facility dependent. So again, it's things like nature studies, citizen science, passive recreation activities. Next slide, please. So then the habitat emphasis alternative, it has 4 additional new policies listed here. Next slide, please. And then it has 4 additional implementation actions listed here. So we're going to switch documents here, and I'm going to actually show you the document that we posted online on Friday. Just wanted to take you through the organizational structure and some highlights in that that document. So we'll give Robin a few minutes here to flip screens and switch documents. There we go. So what you see in front of you here is a series of tables, and the first table starts at the highest level of the plan, if you will. You know, our hierarchy in the plan is objectives, policies, implementation, actions. So this is basically how the objectives stack up in the three major issue areas. So for environmental sustainability, we have 5 objectives listed here. And you can see we're just focused on the base plan, excuse me, at this point. And then can you cursor down to the next page, please, Robin? And then 4 objectives related to balanced recreation use, our second issue area. And then the next page, please. And then 3 objectives for natural hazard mitigation. So that's sort of the initial hierarchy of how objectives relate to our driving issues for this plan. Go ahead and go to the next page, please, Robin. There's another table that follows this. And so under this table, what we've done is we've basically mapped policies to the different objectives. Remember, we had 8 categories of objectives, so you can see there's a series of policies here. And again, bear in mind, these are new policies that we added as we were building the plan. These are in addition to what's in the city's general plan. Can you go ahead and cursor down another page, please, Robin? And then you stop there. So then if you look, we've been looking at the base plan column. So in addition to everything that's in the base plan, if the city wanted to adopt the habitat emphasis alternative, it would include everything in the base plan, plus these items in the right-hand column that are highlighted in yellow. So preserving and enhancing, riparian, and preserving and enhancing native wildlife habitat. Could you go ahead and cursor down a little bit more, please? Yeah, let's get to the implementation table, Robin. Sorry. That'll be a screen blur probably, I know, because that's a couple pages down there still. There we go. Okay, whoops, stop. Okay, so the other thing we did is we took all the implementation actions and put them on a scale of easy to hard in terms of implementation requirements. And there's 34 implementation actions. That includes everything in the base plan, plus the additional implementations that go with the recreation emphasis alternative and the habitat restoration alternative. So we consider easy things, things that could be implemented without additional resources or really changes in operation on the part of city staff. So an example would be providing educational materials about sudden oak death. Medium actions, though, would require a little bit more effort on the city and a little bit more deliberation. They would require maybe changing operations. It would just be a little bit more complex than things in the easy category. So an example here is realigning, adding drainage or otherwise improving trail sections that have been rated to have high erosion hazards. The Rambler Trail, that downhill section that Brian showed, would be one example. And then the third column, those are the hardest things. So the example we give here is periodically inventorying trails and facilities to assess impacts. I won't read the rest. So this is a fairly complex task. This would be sort of building on what WRA did. It would involve probably some interagency coordination. It would involve coordinating with a WRA type firm. It might involve changing the way the city does operations. So that would be a harder item to implement. And I think another way to look at some of these hard to implement items is these are almost like projects on their own. Some of them could go on for years. So just like route designation, designating routes as say one way or single use or multiple use. That process in Marin County, they've been going through that, and they have a big trail system, 300 miles. They've been going through that process for 8 years. So something like route designation is not just a project, it's probably like projects. And you could say the same thing for like trail stream crossings. Each trail stream crossing could require environmental permits from environmental regulatory agencies. It can involve thinking about designing what kind of bridge or crossing would be needed. It could involve compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act. So again, the hard ones, when you go from easy to medium, not a big difference. When you go from medium to hard, there's a fairly big difference in what would be required on the part of the city to implement those actions. So let's stop sharing that document, Robin, and go back to the PowerPoint. We're just about at the end here, folks, and then we'll take questions in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, you gotta stop here. Sorry. Oh, so one other survey question. This is, yeah. So really, we'd like you to know, and we realize this is just a first glance, but based on what you've learned tonight and anything you might have read in that online posted document over the weekend, which management alternatives do you support? And we're asking for a single choice. So the base plan by itself, the base plan with a recreation emphasis, the base plan with a habitat emphasis, or a base plan basically with everything, with the recreation and the habitat emphasis. So please go ahead and vote. Okay. It looks like the base plan and recreation emphasis and the base plan with everything in it are very similar, 37% for the base plan plus recreation emphasis, and a little higher for base plan, recreation, and habitat. Hardly anybody picked base plan alone, so maybe we weren't so robust after all. I don't know, 6%, and about 20% picked the base plan plus the habitat emphasis. So thanks for participating in that poll. I think we've got one more slide to go, and then we'll stop for questions. So the last slide, please, Robin. So basically, in terms of next steps, what we would like the public and the advisory committee to do is review and comment in writing on the environmental assessment document that's been posted and on the recreation use assessment that's going to be posted on the base plan and the alternatives. And the kind of things we're looking for are the ones that you're interested in, are they complete enough? We have 8 different categories of objectives. Did we cover that all in an alternative that you're preferring, or is there some other objective we maybe should have emphasized more, or is there some new objective we didn't even think about? The other thing where we could use the public and the advisory committee's help is priorities. So we've outlined 34 implementation actions. We have not yet recommended to the city. We'll start with this one. We have some ideas internally about what might be the first thing to do, but knowing priorities for people would be a big help for us in helping tighten up the plan and the alternatives. So, those documents are going to be out in the public realm for more than a month. In about 2 weeks, so we're going to meet again. This next meeting is going to be an open house event in person. It's going to be at Hidden Canyon Park from 5 to 7 p.m. We know from past public comments that some members of the public, some commenters, have been wanting to dialogue with the WRA team, so there's going to be a chance to do that. And then over the next 6 or 7 weeks, as we're taking comments in, we're going to refine the plan and alternatives. And then on July 12th, the city will adopt a plan. And it may be the plan and the alternatives as we've described them here. It may be some hybridized version. It may be some new items that get added in. This will be a real interesting time. To me, this is the most interesting time in putting together a plan, because we've done our work and now we're seeking a lot of public input and advisory committee input to see what's going to inform the ultimate plan. So thanks so much for your time, everybody. This is a longer than usual presentation tonight. We had a lot of information to cover, but we're happy to answer whatever questions you might have. So I'll stop there.
And we're going to start the comment period with questions from the advisory committee. If you want to stop sharing, Robin, we can see each other as we listen. You're up, Craig.
Thanks. Thanks, Dana. Are we questions and comments, or is there going to be a or?
We were going to let you guys do comments after the public comment period, but if you would like to
Okay,
do them now,
perfect.
we can.
Nope, that's great. Gosh, so I guess a question. Sorry, maybe a comment, but in some elements where you describe like calming measures as like as a possible implementation, I wonder, will you also provide any quantifiable kind of measurements or metrics to help guide like where that should take place, right? I mean, it's one thing to say you should put calming in, but it's another to say, you know, based on 20 yards of straight shot at 30-degree angle, that really kind of helps. And it may be too simplistic to ask, but I wonder if there's at least some guidance that could be provided to kind of help make it easier for the city to decide where calming should happen.
I'll start and I'll let Robin chime in on that one. So yeah, to your point, Craig, about there's some like decision rules that we could use about whether we have a straight run and whether there's a slope and trail width. Can we use those kinds of things to recommend areas that might be needing calming measure? We could recommend some criteria, yes, that could help inform the city. As far as specific areas, we have not gotten that far in our assessment, but I'm curious what your response to that would be as well, Robin.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so we have like criteria. So that's one of the things that's kind of included in the trail standards and guidelines that we're kind of providing and recommending. Are, you know, what types of things, like what types of calming measures to install, like where they would need to be installed, and criteria for those. As far as like specific locations, like you need to like narrow the trail in this specific section would require additional study to know like which are really the problem areas, you know, for you know, speed, or which are the problem areas for you know, whatever kind of trail conflict
Sure.
people are experiencing, or people want like resolved. You know, so there's also recommendations that we have for kind of making those decisions as well. You know, so that's one of those things, like measuring recreation use can help you narrow down which areas are problematic, and talking to visitors and non-visitors, you know, people who may have been displaced because they said, you know, I had a problem here and I'm not coming back. You know, those two tools can really help you identify those particular locations.
Got it. That sounds great. And then a question about the severe erosion designation. It may be too simplistic, but I wonder, will there be information on whether you feel like there are either common traits or causes that are, you know, to help kind of avoid that in the future, as well as if there are a set of common fixes that may, you know, take those as separate, but just trying to, again, find ways with which to simplify the assessment and understanding, and also the remediation of that.
Sure. So I can start, and again, Robin might be able to chime in. I think on the severe erosion, we'll be able to identify common traits, and I can tell you generally it's either poor trail alignment, placement, or poor design. And there are some more particulars that come along with that. Whether we're going to go segment by segment and say, well, this was the specific cause here, I can think of a few examples where we could easily do that, but there's probably a few that are going to require more investigation, that are going to span the time period we have to finish the plan based on a July 13th end date. But Robin, any other perspective to add there on the trail piece?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it. You know, typically it's an alignment issue. As you know, so if the trail is aligned directly down the fall line, like our, you know, severe example, that's a problem that needs to be realigned across the slope, right? And then the other kind of chief factors in that are like climate and soil type. And so that's something that is also kind of you know, on a case by case basis for each trail segment.
So is it fair to say that it's really kind of structural kind of issues that are at most at play, and I guess usage is more of an amplification of that structural issue, but at the heart, there's where you see that is really just based on kind of trail design as a. Okay.
Yep.
Great. Thanks.
Scott, your hand was up next.
Hi, good evening. With regard to the one-way trails and the single-use trails that have been mentioned, do you at WRA have a plan where these should go and where they should be installed? Or are you just saying to the city of Belmont, hey, we've heard these work, or we think these are a good idea and you should throw some in? Or does this go to Gates and Associate, and do they play around with these ideas? So I'm wondering about that.
Yeah.
First,
Thanks, John. Yeah, so we have some recommendations based on our observations, based on some feedback from the city and some public comments. So we have segments that are included in our recommendations, but those come with a caveat where you know, the users of those trails really should be consulted, because it's really hard to designate one way if nobody wants it to be one way and nobody like complies with it anyway. So you really need the public to be on board, and kind of, you know, with all these trails, they need to make sure that they're you know, built for the or that they're like constructed in a sustainable way, and any like severe erosion issues are kind of taken care of first before you go kind of like changing anything else or any of the use types. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Scott. Bob, your hand is up next.
Yeah, thank you. So just a few items. And again, thanks for the presentation, John and everybody, Robin. So with regard to a couple of things with regard to the, again, going back to what Scott was talking about, the single-use trails, and what about e-bikes? Is there any policy statement that you'd make about e-bikes, and based on what you've seen in other parks and so on? That's one question. And then, you know, some of the, again, the trails that will be designated for single use, I'm for that, because of the one thing I found is a number of neighbors in the area where I live, frankly, don't want to even go on the trails like they did in the past, just because of all the bikes and concern for safety and so on. So I'm definitely, and I think going with one of the comments that, you know, doing follow-up surveys, trying to talk to people that aren't using the open space, I think is an important part of it too. I think we need to find out, again, what we can do to increase the usage of it, especially those people that used to be on it, but they're no longer there. So those are my few questions or comments.
I'm going to pitch those to Robin again. Robin just chaired a session on e-bike policy development a few weeks ago, so she's our resident expert.
Thanks. Yeah, so basically what we're recommending in or like what we found through the recreation use assessment, and you know, like feedback from the city, and kind of what we're recommending is for the city to maybe look into or conduct some further assessments to develop an e-bike policy that will work for Belmont. And so this is based on kind of some other parks in the Bay Area where, you know, so they're kind of seeing how it goes. They're saying, so the Forest Service, for example, has designated some trails, and they're saying kind of evaluating that as they go. And then they have evaluation criteria for designating additional trails to open to e-bikes. So that's an option to kind of have those like pilot studies and see how it's working. But I think additional resources need to be spent on that, including, talking to people, visitors to the open spaces here to develop a policy that's going to work here. Because what kind of came out of this panel that I was just a part of at a conference was that every agency has their own policy. So it's a really unique situation, and I think will require kind of a unique solution for each agency.
I just wanted to add on to that because Bob, I think you and maybe Scott had a similar question about the designation process and looking at one-way and single-use trails. That can be a very long process for many open space areas. It's something that we can help start, make some targeted recommendations, but some entities like Marin County Open Space, they've been going through their designation process for 8 years. Now they have a couple hundred miles of trails, but to Robin's point, public input and more input than we're able to glean by, just throwing a few questions out during our PowerPoint, it usually does involve fairly robust public involvement. So that's another one of those projects kind of things, I think.
And Lynn, I see your hand raised. Before I ask you to speak, I just want to let all the attendees know, please raise your hand if you'd like to speak. We are getting a little bit close to the end here, so I just want to make sure we know how many people would like to speak before we transition to the public comment period, because after that, we will be coming back to the advisory committee for their comments. So if you're an attendee and you would like to make a comment during the public comment period, please raise your hand now. We will, once we start that, cut off who can talk. So if you are interested, make sure you have your hand raised before we start. And Lynn, it's your time to ask questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you again to your group, WRA, for doing a very thorough report. It took all of my attention over 2 days this weekend to feel like I had an idea of what was going on. You've answered most of my questions. I have a couple of really basic. Passive versus active use. Give me an example of active use, please.
Sure. So active use would be playing soccer or playing basketball. So it depends on a facility, right? So for a basketball game, you need a court, you need some hoops. Soccer field, you need the boundaries drawn and some nets. So basically an active kind of recreation requires building some sort of facilities.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's great. I wouldn't have guessed that. So thank you so much. And then I just had one question left on erosion. The report refers to instances of erosion, and I didn't know on a given trail is each instance separated by so many feet, or just how are you looking at these? Because there was a tally for instances, so I didn't know the definition.
Yeah, that was intentional because when we originally wrote our scope for this project, we said we would qualitatively evaluate trail erosion. We didn't try to quantify soil loss or even like the length or the width of an area. It's just, what we would call a point estimate. It's 1 point, within your open space area. Here's an area where there's some high erosion. And there's photos that go with it, which can give you sort of a clue as to the aerial extent, but we did not quantify the area or the potential soil loss.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. And David, you're next.
Thank you. So I have a question. Well, my question, I've got a couple, but one of my major questions is, what are we being asked to do? And the reason why I state it that way is my understanding from your presentation is that that not all of the sections are complete, that you still are working on some of the work. Maybe I'm incorrect in that. And so how do we give feedback for potentially our last meeting on an incomplete plan that will then go very quickly to the city council. And I understand that additional research will have to be done, a deeper dive will have to be done on certain issues. You've made that very clear, John. And I appreciate that, because I came in with the understanding that we were going to provide input to the city council on a completed plan. And that's erroneous. That's not true. And that's okay. Maybe that was my own understanding. But if not all of the sections are finished from the work that you're doing, how do we give you feedback on an incomplete plan?
Well, right now that's a good question. So right now there is one document online that includes the environmental assessment as well as the base plan and the management alternative. So we are seeking comment at this time on that document, written comment. It could be questions on the environmental assessment, such as the ones we're getting tonight. It could be specific feedback on the base plan or the management alternatives, asking for clarification on what an implementation action is, asking if there are other implementation actions you would like to see us put in there, looking at sort of the overall structure of goals and objectives and asking us whether or not there's enough policy, say under the recreation emphasis alternative, there's one policy that's specific to recreation that would be in addition to the base plan. So there's a document that we are wanting comment on, and next week, a week from tonight, we will have the recreation use assessment available for comment. And I can tell you that everything that's gone into the management plan alternatives document is based on the recreation use assessment as it's written now. We at WRA has a fairly rigorous internal review process. That's why it's held up. We're doing some final reviews. And yeah, there's a possibility that there might be some change that happens in that this week. I'm a little doubtful of that. But you know, that I could see where that would cause some confusion or may have to have us take a step back on what's in the base plan or the management alternatives. But I'm being optimistic here and saying that what's in there has been used to drive and inform the plan, and it's not going to change based on our internal review.
Okay, my follow-up, one of my follow-up questions is, how specific are the objectives, plans, alternatives, whatever language you're using? Because I found that many of the statements in there were very general, they were very broad, they're not measurable necessarily. And so I'm concerned with the writing being, what I'd like to know is, when you write something, it should pretty much stand the test of time, that what we mean today, someone who is not involved in this conversation, someone who's on Park and Rec, City Council, years from now, will also understand the intent of what we're talking about. It feels like some of the statements are very open-ended to the point that people can make their own interpretation and not, it's not specific enough to make sure that we really know what we mean and what we're saying. And so I only was able, because I realized that the document was sent, and I didn't realize it was sent on Friday. I haven't finished the document. It is very weighty, and I would love more time to be able to go through it. But I have tons of comments on the first 8 pages, for example. And depending on how it's written, you could have a slant that is more environmental or more recreational. And so I'm not sure if I was a city council member that I would know what to do with this, because on the face of it, and this is not meant to be overly aggressive, but it says a lot, but then at the same time, when I'm reading it, it doesn't say as much as you think when you read it, because it can mean everything and nothing at the same time. And so that's my concern, is that and this is more of a statement, Bridget, I'm sorry, I'm delving into the statement, but there isn't enough time to roll our shirt sleeves up and really talk about from, you know, ES1 all the way through. And it's come up with general statements. And by virtue of individuals giving feedback, we don't have the benefit of listening to everyone else. And so we're not really doing, at least from my perspective, the job that we need to do. And I'm not talking about favoring one perspective over another. It's just really listening to what people are saying and saying, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. And so I think this meeting and then pushing it forward to the community and then pushing it forward to council feels like it's on a very, very tight timeline in which not enough work has gone in now that we've seen it for the first time this past weekend. And now we're being asked to give feedback, and it's going to be in the city council's hand on July 12th. And they're going to expect that we've done our due diligence and a thorough review. I'm not sure we have been afforded to be able to do that. So just some comments and questions. So I'll take whatever feedback offline.
Yeah, I think this might be one that both Bridget and I have to answer, but in reference to like the level of specificity that's in the objectives and policies, that's fairly comparable to other open space city or county jurisdictions that we work with. And even the implementation actions are at a similar scale to what I've developed and what WRA has developed for other jurisdictions. And there is follow-on work. I mean, I think we were trying to make that point earlier that this isn't the end, this is like the beginning. So there is follow-on work to make those implementation actions more measurable. We did try to make them more measurable than the policies and the objectives that are in the plan and the management alternatives. But I hear what you're saying, that you could make them even more specific, but that my understanding was that was beyond the scope of this, what we consider a fairly high level management plan. But I think maybe Bridget might want to weigh in on this as well. So I'll stop there.
Well, good questions, David. And yes, it does feel like we're kind of, racing towards a finish line here. We do have a commission meeting tomorrow night. So, and we will have so we'll actually have 2 commission meetings between now and the time of the city council meeting on the 12th. So if there's any other feedback that the advisory committee can provide then, and you're on the committee, you're welcome to, send anything to me or to the info@belmontprosplan.com, any kind of feedback or questions, and we'll make sure that we get that and incorporate or address those questions and concerns between now and then. So we have a little bit more time. I just want to make clear that it's not going straight from tonight to council. We do have 2 more iterations with the commission to get some other feedback and input, but I hear what you're saying.
And Bob, I see your hand raised again.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo David's point, which I thought was really done well, that again, everything seems very general. And again, I'm just echoing what David said. I felt the exact same thing. Again, it's not specific. And I guess, moving forward, not even taking into consideration it's July 12th or whatever it is coming up right upon us. It just leaves it really open to interpretation, I guess, at least from my point of view, as to what is going to be implemented. And that just, it kind of gives me cause for concern. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Bob. And Sergio, I see your hand.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you, WRA, for your presentation. It was done very well. It actually helped me today. I got the report on Friday, but honestly, I didn't open it up until today because of the long weekend. So I'm not really prepared. But I did want to say what Bob and David was talking about, what we're being asked to do. I did like the polling that you did this evening. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to answer the one about management alternatives because I just didn't have enough information. I'm just still absorbing the information now, and the presentation helps a lot. And I'm glad to hear that we're going to have some more time to be able to give feedback. So I guess my understanding is that today is not our last opportunity to give feedback. But that was my comments, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Sergio. And Susan?
Yeah, I have a question of, you mentioned an event on June 13th, and I just wondered what the nature of that would be in terms of how you'd be gathering feedback on site.
We are still working out the details of the venue, but I think we had talked about basically presenting some information on the base plan and the management alternatives and trying to answer people's questions about it. I have found in the past that doing things actually at a park in a live venue gets some good dialogue going. And I know there's been some commenters that have mentioned, they wanted a dialogue with members of the consultant team. So we thought we would switch things up a little bit, but I think we would probably try to present similar and maybe a little bit more information on the base plan and the management alternatives.
Thank you.
I'll just step in there. It's not going to be a presentation that starts at a certain time and
Right.
that we have seats there. It's going to be, it's sort of more of an open house, pop-up tent, one-on-one or three-on-one conversations. And representatives from WRA will be there. I'll be there as well. And it's a nice opportunity to kind of connect one-on-one with folks and maybe hear from people some of their thoughts on these management alternatives or some of the maybe some specific information about, hey, here's a particular, high-speed hotspot or an area where I've noticed that, the sight lines aren't good, and we could sort of put pins on the map to identify some of those areas, and that will help us get a little closer to implementing some of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, to improve the visitor experience.
And Scott?
I'd just like to finish up with a comment. At the start of the year, I was excited to hear that Belmont had hired an open space consultant to assess our open space conditions in the present time and whether or not our current levels of recreation, whether they be hiking, biking, dog walking, running, whether or not these things are sustainable. I've been even more excited to hear that WRA, a professional environmental consulting group with a team of biologists and ecologists, have assessed the conditions of the park with respect to our flora and fauna as being pretty good. Also heartening, very heartening to hear from them that the trail density in the open space is at its present level. It's not a problem and therefore reasonably sustainable. So I think loud and clear what I'm hearing from the report is we have a team of professional biologists say that the ecosystem in our park is reasonably healthy. Going forward, I hope that residents who continue to assert that recreation is destroying the wildlife and the overall ecosystem in our open spaces are understood to be inconsistent with professional ecologists. And then today I was in the park and I was lucky enough to be able to leave work early and rode my bike into the park around 2 o'clock. I was at the top of Lake Road where the Hallmark trailhead starts. And I noticed 2 kids ride their bikes into the open space with backpacks on. And I was doing some maintenance on my bike and I said, hey, are you guys riding your bikes home from Fox Elementary? And they say, no, we're middle schoolers. We go to Ralston. We ride our bikes after school up Ralston, and then we turn left on Hallmark, and then we come into the park, and we ride home through the park. And I'm like, wow, you guys have got like the best commute of anybody I know. So to me, this is what leaving the open space open for multi-use gets us. It's kids going out of their way to ride through it for fun after school. Can you imagine a better way of ending your school day with a friend and getting some exercise? So I'd like to see the city of Belmont declare the entire open space as continued multi-use into the future. And that's my feelings on the issue.
Thank you, Scott. And Karen, it looks like your hand was just raised.
Yes, thank you so much to WRA for your report and your presentation. I did have a question. Many months ago, a report was circulated to the members of the committee from, I believe, the Friends of Water Dog. It was, I believe, a wildlife biologist. And I was wondering if you had the opportunity to review that report, and if so, if you had any comments on that report and its relevance to today's proceeding.
We received a number of reports. Do you recall who the submitter was or what the report was? Sorry. Not.
I apologize on my email. I don't have it. I was looking for it. My understanding was it was the Friends of Water Dog, and it was a wildlife biologist. It was an assessment of the open space, and my understanding was that it did call into question some of the condition of the trails. It said that they were that there were issues in terms of the environmental quality of those trails and impacts. So, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me. But
Okay.
I was wondering if you did review it at all. And I believe it was a public comment from the last meeting mentioning that report as well.
Yes. Okay. Now I'm remembering the report. So I'll start, and Brian may want to also chime in here. So I know Leslie Lazarati, who's not with us tonight, reviewed it, and I reviewed it. And it was an interesting report to me in that it summarized a lot of recreation ecology literature from studies that have been done all over the United States and made some fairly broad generalizations about potential impacts of recreation from trail use on biological resources. Then it jumped from those fairly general studies to some very, what I would consider prescriptive solutions about closing specific trails and about impacts. And my reaction was, well, we don't have enough data, and we still don't have enough data at this point in time to be able to say that, which is why we're recommending, as far as implementation, to look at some of these trails on a one-off basis, determine, specific management direction. So my reaction was that report summarized some good literature, but that it was speculating because based on what looked like even perhaps lesser level of effort field assessment than what WRA did, the author seemed to be drawing some conclusions that were not able to be substantiated from a scientific basis. And Brian, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or not.
No, I think that summarizes it just fine.
Thank you.
I don't see any more questions from the advisory committee, and we have 12 people who've raised their hands of attendees who would like to comment. So I'm going to switch over to that portion of our time this evening. We're going to give everybody, what was it, Bridget? Minute and a half, 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes to speak. Please just respect your time and everybody else is here on this event as we share your comments. So the first hand I see is Ryan. I'm going to give you permission to talk. And Ryan, you have 2 minutes.
Can folks see the timer?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right.
Great. Hi, everybody. Area resident, former Belmont business owner, big fan of the Belmont open spaces. I've been following this for a long time online. First time joining live. So thank you for this opportunity, and thanks for all the hard work, both the WRA and to our advisory committee. I have more of a question than a comment. My question is that based on the first part of tonight's presentation, it didn't sound like there was any evidence that recreational activity was impacting the habitat. And it sounds from the online survey like maybe I'm not the only one wondering this, but what's the rationale for preparing and proposing a habitat protection emphasis alternative plan? Or to flip it around and put it the other way, why doesn't the evidence lead you to recommending a recreation emphasis plan?
We're not going to be answering questions during this portion of the meeting, but thank you so much, Ryan, for stating that for us, that we can.
We'll leave it as a comment then. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. And next up is going to be Michael Monroe. You should have permission to unmute yourself, and you have 2 minutes.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much to the Commission for their service. I know this has been a very challenging task for an awfully long time. And thank you for WRA for the report that you've given us. One thing that I would recommend is that this has been a series of contentious issues for months and months and years, but we can start with some things that we all agree upon. Improving stream crossings of the trails is pretty obvious to anyone that that's something that could be done. So I would heartily recommend that perhaps that's a good place to start. And there's probably some other things that I think all stakeholders would agree upon. I found it very interesting that on page 46 of the report, it was documented that the unmapped trails have much less erosion than the mapped trails. And I would imagine that this is due to the fact that they were built more recently and follow better trail building practices, i.e. don't go right down the fall line and get eroded out by water. So that's something that we should take into account when we consider how to manage our trails going forward. I think the quality of the trail is way more important than its longevity. On the comment of one-way or single use, I'm not sure that there's many candidates for one-way trails in Water Dog, but if there are, then that could be helpful. It's something that I had put out during the early days of COVID, but people seem to think it wouldn't work very well. In terms of single use, I would really want to know what problem exactly are we trying to solve. I know some people have a perception of safety issues, but I would want to have some better evidence before taking this step. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Perfect timing. Denise, you are up next, and you should have permission to unmute.
Thank you. So we're being told tonight that everything's fine. The native habitat is fine, the wildlife is fine. The high trail density in Water Dog has no negative impacts. And like other people who have read this report, you read a lot of words, but there's nothing really tangible, nothing really concrete. It could be interpreted any which way. Good things are said about the importance of preserving habitat, and then it's saying everything's fine and maybe you need more new trails. But this is what the wildlife biologist from Friends of Water Dog said, and this is what's being ignored tonight. The Conservation Lands Network identified 91% of the study area is essential for conservation goals for San Francisco. Quote, these lands serve vital functions in any network configuration, and attaining conservation goals across the Bay Area will be difficult without them. Didn't hear how important Water Dog is, really. We don't talk about that. Also, the Wildlife Ecologist report highlighted the effects of trails on wildlife habitat. It extends considerable distances beyond the trails. This is not, some broad science from across the country that doesn't have application here. This is current studies that are being conducted around the world about the impacts of trails on wildlife. It says here, many wildlife species are intolerant of humans and avoid using habitats near trails. Behavioral avoidance of habitat due to human activity is termed functional habitat loss. This is not something that doesn't apply to Water Dog. The ecologist said, quote, trail density is one of the main factors affecting wildlife in the open space recreation. But WRA's position is that the trail density in Water Dog has no negative impacts. That is not based on science. WRA's position is not based on current science. Lastly, I would like to just say that they've looked heavily at endangered and threatened species in their report. In fact,
Denise,
that's all.
your 2 minutes. I'm going to have to cut you off. Thank you so much for your comment today. And Scott, you are up next with 2 minutes.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to thank Scott Sizemore for his comments. I agree wholeheartedly with what he said about the kids riding through the trail system. That's exactly the kind of stuff that I love to see when I'm out there as well. On the topic of single use and single direction trails, I just want to say that having been involved in Water Dog for many, many years, over 25 years, that, bikers help build most of these trails, and we've never once asked for anybody to, we've always wanted to share the trails. We've never asked for single use or single direction trails. I think it's kind of counter to the recreational use that makes Water Dog so special. And so I oppose making any of these trails single use or single direction. I like them all in both directions and use them in both directions, and think that we should have more information, more data that suggests that this is required before we actually make such a drastic change. I'd like to encourage recreation for all users, and given the report stating that so much of our park is in good shape, in my opinion, it's in better shape than it's been in those 25 years. If it's not broke, why fix it? Why make any changes here if, in fact, we've had full recreational use for 3 decades and it's still in good shape? Why change trails? Why remove redundant trails, whatever that means. You know, why not add more trails? Because I think, as we found, the newer trails are the ones that have less use, less erosion. So why not build more and distribute that use across more trails and make it so that that all the trails get a little bit less use and a little more love. Lastly, I don't really understand the focus on e-bikes. I haven't seen any evidence. I don't ride an e-bike personally, but I haven't seen them out there. I haven't seen any evidence that they're doing any more damage than any other trail users. And I'd hope that before we made any sort of policy decisions around e-bikes, that we would do it with data instead of just a knee-jerk reaction against a new type of trail user. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Paul Shang, you are up next with 2 minutes for your comments.
Thank you. Just kind of piggybacking on the prior commenters' comments. I think that one thing that should be considered is our local, traditions, customs, our practices, and our kind of local culture. But before the cycling community built all the trails in Water Dog, it was just an unusable, basically, patch of poison oak. And as the prior commenter said, those trails were built for everyone, not just cyclists. And cyclists have never demanded, their own trails. So the whole idea behind it was to create trails for everyone, especially when the Lake Loop Trail was built. That was something built by the cycling community specifically to accommodate strollers and families and getting kids into see some riparian stuff there. So also, I think if you look at the pros principles guiding the plan, two of them are to promote inclusion to people of all backgrounds, and another point is to foster a sense of community and encourage social interaction. And that's exactly what multi-use does. We're just making it trails that are available for everyone and encourages people of all different walks of life to interact. And I think if we moved in the direction of single-use trails, you're kind of segregating people. You're creating special classes of users who get, more privileges than others. And I think that really counters the goal of fostering community and this kind of shared togetherness we have there. So anyway, I just want to close out my time by saying thanks a lot. I appreciate all the work that's gone into this, and I especially appreciate how WRA has basically brought some actual science into this, some scientific methods, some real studies, some real data, unlike some of the things that were submitted by advocacy groups. And I think that we have a good plan going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Jennifer, your hand was raised next. I should have given you permission to speak, and you have 2 minutes for public comment.
Thank you. I'd like to address the balanced recreational policies portion of the document, which I agree currently lacks specific details, which should be forthcoming next week, and I look forward to seeing that. However, I have some recommendations for Robin regarding that issue. Policy number 20 and number 31 address a focus on slowing travel speeds, but no actual speed is ever mentioned. Many parks and open spaces, as well as the Sierra Club, recommends a maximum 15 miles per hour for safe bike trail use. That speed should be posted on bike trail signs that allow users to report to Park and Rec any violators. Policy number 20 also includes adapting and decommissioning legacy trails following further public outreach. But which legacy trails do you have in mind? Similarly, policy number 21, prohibiting certain trail uses or restrictions to enhance safety and minimize conflicts between trails is very important. But unless you designate exactly which narrow trails should be allocated to hikers only, this balanced recreational policy remains unbalanced and unfair to hikers, because bikers from the entire Bay Area are currently allowed on every single trail, wide and narrow. You know, the reason why many residents don't come here to make public comments complaining about the safety on narrow Water Dog trails is because, as my neighbor across the street said to me, my girls don't feel safe with bikes on Water Dog trails. So we just go hiking elsewhere at other local parks. The reason many bikers come here to repeat their public comments claiming that they get along just fine with all the other users is because Water Dog is the only open space in the area that allows bikers to speed on their narrow trails. How is this balanced and equitable for all users?
Thank you, Jennifer. That's 2 minutes. I'm going to have to cut off your public comment. We appreciate your thoughts. Eric, you are up next.
Great, thank you. Thank you, WRA, for putting this together. It is a long read, and I did have some specific comments, but this conversation tonight, I want to sort of get to one thing in particular. I wasn't able to vote, but I would have voted for the recreation emphasis plan, just for the record. This is a park surrounded by all sides by development. And the park's hugely important to the flavor of Belmont, and in particular, the hills. I'm really confused. In the last meeting and in your environmental assessment, it seems that the overall opinion was that environmentally the park is in good shape and that the trails are in pretty good shape. And I just want to know, how does this lead to sort of a default state of we're going to recommend single direction or single use trails, or having that become the default? It's a tiny minority of trail users that are pushing for this. You can see it in every poll that has gone on about the park. And so what evidence of overuse or misuse or incorrect use is this assumption based on? If it's not environmental and it's not because of the condition of the trails, what is it? And if it's the 4 or 10 users that are screaming about restricting access versus the thousands of other trail users who have fantastic experiences here, you guys had better have more than anecdotal evidence of why this needs to be done. I understand the pressure that what WRA and the city's under from some very loud voices, but there are thousands of users who aren't part of this meeting who rely on this trail system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Next up is Kristen, and you have 2 minutes.
So in the very first paragraph of this draft, you pull a very deceitful sleight of hand by redefining the concept of balance. You've redefined it to be balance only between trail use and maintenance. That's not what the general plan says. And I'll quote page 5.3, human safety and recreation opportunities must be balanced with maintaining a proper functioning of natural systems. That's the plan. That's what was promised to residents. That's the blueprint of the general plan. And that means natural habitats share equal priority with recreation. The general plan doesn't allow you to prioritize recreation over the environment. It tells you you will balance recreation with proper functioning of natural systems. A natural system does not mean just a few endangered species. It means all species of plants and animals, all elements of air, water, soil that are critical to a balanced habitat that sustains itself as a whole system. So your narrow focus on species, special status species, and picking recreation is invalid. But I do agree with everyone that you need more facts and more data. And so your declaration that the trail density is not impacting habitat is completely unfounded and bogus. You have no data about trail use. You have no before and after data. You have no benchmarking with other open space areas. Residents can give you plenty of observational data that when they opened that Soho Trail illegally without city permission, the wildlife that used to visit their backyard disappeared. So you have no basis on which to declare that this habitat is not impacted.
Thanks, Kristen. We appreciate your comments. Up next is going to be Pat. And Pat, before you start, I just want to let everybody know we are not going to take any more hands. So Rhonda, you will be last. Pat, you have 2 minutes.
All right. Some of WRA conclusions are by their own admittance not supported by their methodology. For instance, WRA stated trail density and recreation are not having an effect on the presence of common or sensitive wildlife species. Yet, WRA also admits that their assessment was not a research project and, more importantly, was not a series of wildlife surveys to verify the presence of common or sensitive wildlife species. Without any studies to verify the presence of special status or common wildlife species, there is simply no way WRA can state with any certainty that trail density and recreation are not having an effect on the presence of wildlife. Simply put, By WRA's own admittance, they really don't know what, if any, effects trail density and recreation are having on wildlife. If WRA didn't do any scientific studies to support their conclusion, then they shouldn't be stating false conclusions as if they are facts. It's not only unscientific, it's unprofessional and it's blatantly misleading. To me, this misleading false conclusion reeks of promotion of an anti-wildlife, pro-recreation agenda. Pros committee members, Parks and Recs commissioners, and Parks and Recs department need to be discerning when reading WRA's assessment, and any conclusions by WRA that are not supported by quantitative scientific evidence need to be rejected outright. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Up next is going to be Greg Wang. And Greg, you have 2 minutes.
Thanks very much. I know that the recreational use assessment plan is not ready yet, and so we're all looking forward to that. I just, want to say I was exposed to the NICA Youth Mountain Biking Leagues through my work over the last year. It's traditionally for high schoolers, but they've now added middle schoolers. And what that organization fosters for kids who might not play traditional sports is amazing. And Belmont having a place where the kids on these teams can practice and learn, it's something that should be celebrated and fostered, that environment for them to do something that's healthy and engaging, better than video games, better than staring at a phone, certainly actually experiencing nature, But another thing I wanted to, just speak to, which is kind of related, is that, in the last few decades since mountain biking became, has become a very popular activity, one of the great evolutions that you've seen from it, and Water Dog appears to be a good example of this, is that the cyclists are very much stewards. They definitely are out there volunteering, doing trail work, trying to make these parks better for everybody. And going back to, those NICA leagues teams that I mentioned when I first started speaking, that source of volunteers, those teams, those kids need to get their high school community service hours. And those teams need to get, they get bonuses for their league when they do trail work. That's an excellent source for volunteers for park work. You're much less likely to have, if there's restricted access. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Connie, you're up next, and you have 2 minutes.
Hi, I was a little concerned in reading the documentation that was reviewed. It seemed that it omitted the original document. This is specifically for the Water Dog Lake Preserve. The area, the land was gifted to the city by John Brooks, as far as I understand, and that it was for the purpose of, maintaining the natural state of the land. And it seems to me that calling habitat preservation emphasis an alternative, as opposed to sort of part of the base plan, which I think you actually say preservation of, habitat is part of the base plan, is having that separate and as an alternative, as if it's an option. It's like, no, the purpose of the open space is to preserve the habitat in its natural state, and looking at, and the city should be obligated to abide by whatever agreement was given when that land was donated to begin with. So that was an kind of an oversight. I just want to comment about e-bikes. When I go hiking, I want to enjoy total peace and quiet, and I don't want to hear the hum of any motor at all. Even if it's an electric motor, it's still a buzz that's not natural, and I don't want to have to, I just don't think that any motorized, whether it's electric or not, should be allowed in there. And in terms of single-use trails, as long as they're going slow and they'll say, excuse me, and give you ample time to get out of the way, that's okay. But yeah.
Connie, that's 2 minutes. I want to thank you for your comment. We're going to move on to Jonathan Carter. Jonathan, you have 2 minutes.
Well, I wanted to thank WRA for putting in so much effort, and the community of Belmont truly appreciates your expertise. I just wanted to make one short comment as you are preparing the recreational component of the project. And that's just, don't look at Water Dog and San Juan Canyon in isolation. Be sure you consider it in lieu of the other regional park system. I think what the cyclists are most concerned about is restriction of access, because if you live in the Mid-Peninsula and you want to ride your bike, you really only have two choices, Water Dog and El Corte Madera Creek. Whereas if you want to go take a hike and if you want to have it free of cyclists entirely, you have a number of options right in Belmont's neighborhood. There's across the street, there's the Crystal Springs Cross Country Course, which is actually larger acreage than Water Dog. There's Big Canyon, there's Pulgus Ridge, there's Edgewood, there's Eaton Park, there's Mills Canyon Park. A little bit farther south, there's the Fledger Estate and Huddard Park. And so if you look at all of the miles of trails regionally, probably 80–90% are hiker only. And Water Dog is unusual in that it allows multi-use. And I think the cycling community has been really magnanimous in saying this should be multi-use. We're willing to share the trails. And I think there's lots of options for people who want a hiking only experience without cyclists. So please just take a look at the regional park system beyond just the boundaries of City of Belmont as you put together the recreational plan. Thanks for all the great work so far.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thaddeus, you are up next with 2 minutes.
All right, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can.
All right, excellent, excellent. So I just wanted to say thanks to the committee and to WRA for really careful discussion and assessments. I think you hear, a wide variety of voices from the community. Some might sound a little negative or hostile. I hope the greater view that you hear is that people are really, really appreciative of your work. And what I really wanted to do here tonight is just to zoom out and just to think about for a moment, how lucky are we to have this beautiful place, right? I mean, we are just so fortunate to have this wonderful trail system. And I think that we can really approach it with just a super positive energy because that's really what it deserves. And despite the fact that it's completely ringed by houses and busy roads, it's this beautiful little oasis of multi-use trails, and the system is working really well. You'll hear from a couple bitter people that, it's scary for them. I actually never see them out there. I'm on the trails all the time. I never, ever see the people that are complaining about the trails on the trails, but I see all the happy people out on the trails all the time. This weekend, my kids were bouncing around the house and I sent them out, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old out onto the trails to have a beautiful mountain bike ride. And when they came back, they were flushed and they were smiles. And so I think we just want to continue to support what we have. I'm so heartened to hear that the environmental assessment conducted by WRA, which is really the first scientific assessment that's been done, shows that the environment's in good shape, despite being ringed by homes. And I think that's testament to all the hard work that the volunteers have been doing to keep the trails in good shape. So thank you again, everybody, for your hard work.
Thank you for your comment today, Thaddeus. And our last comment during the meeting right now is going to be Rhonda. Rhonda, you have permission to unmute and 2 minutes for public comment.
Thank you so much for letting me comment. I really appreciate it. I'm new to this. I'm taking in all of the information and I'm learning, and I guess I'm also going to kind of zoom out in my perspective, which also I want to say about road and path building. I think it's been pretty well established by science that any road anywhere is going to really inhibit the movement of wildlife and plants. It's been studied that things don't grow near the roads, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, but what I want to say is that I've recently become aware of a movement. It's called the 30 by 30 movement, and it's a political environmental movement to help people wrap their minds around putting a third of land aside for non-use, non-development by 2030. And I know that the parks are recreational and public, Water Dog Lake and the other park. But I think that if we're just thinking in terms of the survival of the quality of our fauna and flora and humans as a species in the future, because we're already setting up so many conditions under which to make ourselves extinct, it's like the more we can help preserve the habitat into the future, the better. I also have nightmares about the Crystal Springs Reservoir, and I know that probably a lot of people in the water dog biker community also want to open up the reservoir. So I think whatever we're doing in Belmont has big potential effects onto keeping the reservoir open or closed. And of course, I'm a huge advocate fan of keeping the Crystal Springs Reservoir completely closed to any people. So thank you very much. And oh, I'm available to volunteer. Yay! There you go. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. We appreciate your comments and everybody else who spoke today. I want to open it back up to the advisory committee for any final comments that they would like to say before we wrap up the advisory committee meeting this evening. Ula, I see your hand first if you'd like to go.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. And oops, sorry about that. And thank you so much to WRA for a very comprehensive report. And I will keep my comments very brief. I want to point out that there has been some comment about the report being vague and not detailed. And I do just want to point out that there are 39 policies with 28 actions associated with them. And for that, I am grateful. I think overall, we have a big picture that tells us that our open space is in generally good condition, which is helpful to hear as a Parks and Rec commissioner. And while more detail is always welcome, I do think some of that work will have to be done in the future. With regard to the recreational emphasis alternative and the habitat protection emphasis alternative, to me, I think that for the most part, both of these are achievable and they're not mutually exclusive or in conflict with one another. And so while the base plan, I think, probably prioritizes those items that need to be completed first, I think we should be interested in both promoting the recreational use and the habitat protection emphasis. So I don't see in any case where those are really in conflict with one another. So I'm actually in support of expanding the base plan to include, for the most part, both of those. Thank you.
Thank you, Ula. And Craig, your hand was raised next.
Yeah, thanks. Once again, great work. I really appreciate the holistic, efficient approach, kind of based on what I believe are strong foundations and scientific evidence. So that's great. And I look forward to what I believe is going to be a comprehensive set of recommendations. I hope that there is a strong sense of what I'll call clustering and prioritizing. And so to be able to go beyond just what's easy, medium, hard, but also have a little bit of a time-based as well as kind of organization that could help the city put things into more effect. I think that with regards to David's comments and some of the comments of the community, I know that there was some element of describing what this plan is and what this plan isn't, or what this document is and what this document isn't. I think we should err on the side of like over explaining and kind of setting certain expectations to be able to outline, again, what this is, what this isn't, and what it should be used for. And while I agree with Ula that there's a lot of depth to the things that you include in the document. I still see this as like the start of what we would do with a park, which is have general understandings of things, have reasonable sets of expectations, but when we start to actually execute, there's more work to be done to define the work itself and how we're going to get to it. And so just like with the park, there's going to be master plans associated with what I see as kind of like the phases of work that needs to be done in the open space. I also agree with David in that what I see missing so far is like a lack of like digestible, understandable elements, right? We jump right into a table and then you go into deep copy. And so maybe that will come with the second set of pages that will follow, but I would like to see more clear summaries, more clear call outs. This means X, trying to help the casual user understand all that's there and kind of and how to interpret it. And also, I mean, lots of agreement, and I agree with Ula that I want it all. And so I think and even naming these alternatives has a exclusionary kind of connotation to me, like it's an either or, where I think this could be just supplemental. And I think that these all could be really part of a bigger base that's just phased and prioritized accordingly. And so not even to kind of try to segment and try to guess and leave it to interpretation. And so I think that to me would be my personal belief to be able to do. The last bit I'll say is that I kind of challenge you to be inventive and kind of err on the side of more ideas or examples of things. For example, one thing that caught my eye, I think it was P19 when it talked about accessibility and inclusiveness. Even though there are things that you see are like opportunities for, I'm not sure if this is the right approach, but I've seen it elsewhere where there's an initial segment of a trail that's paved. Makes it easier to access for wheelchairs and other limited mobility. And I'm not at all saying we pave this place, but maybe there are some spots that are kind of readily accessible that could be. And also the other thing in terms of the visitor experiences, I think that there's opportunity, Robin, which I'm sure you have a ton of ideas, but just ideas that are more than just kind of what I see are like moving, hiking, biking, walking, and other ways with which to have passive enjoyment that really kind of, again, I look forward to seeing those enhanced visitor opportunities. So thanks.
Thank you, Craig. Susan, you're up next.
Great, thank you. And thank you to WRA for the presentation. And I appreciated what was said a few minutes ago about providing that context of what the scope of the plan was intended to do. And I think obviously we all want more, but I appreciate you providing that sense of how to think about it. And I guess one suggestion I think might be helpful is to, in explaining that, I'm sure there'll be a preamble or something that explains that, but maybe at the end to have a sense of what are next steps and where should we go from here. And that's what the reason I was asking what that on-site session was going to be about, is that's exactly what I think is needed, is that crowdsourcing element of really dialing into the details. And so I think explaining in the plan, here are some things that could happen next, so that we can really figure out how to get this to be actionable. So, and I appreciated that the color thing of what's, easy, medium, hard. Even in the hard things, I think parsing it out, that, what are some steps that could be taken that get us farther along the path. So I think people do want to see this starting to implement as quickly as we can. There's that sense of, with plans, of course, it feels like there's years before anything would really happen. And I think people do want to see what are things that can start happening as soon as we can. But thank you all for the effort.
Thank you, Susan. And Lynn?
Hi, thanks again. I had my initial two comments that were going to be questions, but they were answered earlier, was the recreational versus habitat protection, and were they mutually exclusive, and why did they have to be? And it sounds like they are not at all. So I do wish to throw my support, which I did clicking the button earlier, on integrating both, because that's what this open space is. We need to protect it, and we need to be able to enjoy it. My other question is this upcoming recreation use assessment. Does that sub-report is it already included in what we have now? And it's just not ready to be standalone, or will this general plan, the document we currently have, be updated in order to coincide with the release of the recreation use assessment?
John, you want to?
Sure. So yes, so that's a good question. So there's a part of the recreation use assessment that we drew upon tonight in our presentation, and that we drew upon in developing the base plan management alternatives document. But there are other sections that you haven't seen yet. So it could be that, yeah, the management plan and alternative sections do get some additional text, and the recreation use assessment will be published as a standalone document. But I could see a need to integrate key portions of that into the existing documentation that the advisory committee's already had a chance to look at.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And David?
Thank you. And thank you to everyone here tonight, those listening and those participating. Bridget, this is for you and for the rest of the people listening. I think we've missed an opportunity. And the opportunity is we've still got separation for the environmentalists and sustainability and the bikers. And maybe I'm overgeneralizing, maybe I'm not, but we're hearing still that type of us and them. And I hope that you and your staff can think, because I was hoping that we would be able through this process to bring people together. And that's obviously not happening. And I hope that if you and your staff think about this along with WRA, maybe, is there a way still to be able to bring both sides together so that we bring a higher level of trust and understanding? It appears to me that both sides aren't listening to each other, and there is some disconnect or a lot of disconnect. And I was hoping that people through the 5 meetings would listen to each other and feel more comfortable listening to each other and understanding, and that's not happening. So I hope that you all can put your thinking caps on and figure out a way to bring the groups together, find out what's missing, meet those needs, and then both will be better off. And we as a community will be better off. I've said before that I was hoping that both would enjoy using the open space and protecting it and having similar goals, but we're still not speaking the same language. And so I feel disheartened, but I hope that at some point both let their guard down a little bit and wish the best for each other. And there's not a win or a loss, hopefully, but both of a win-win situation. I'll just leave it at that. But that's I'm walking away from this process feeling we've lost an opportunity.
Thank you for your comments tonight, David.
David, I'll just step in real quickly. And I know that the document just came out on Friday, and a lot of people had weekend plans and didn't spend their Memorial Day weekend digesting the document. But I do encourage advisory committee and the community to take a minute, well, more than a minute, to take a deeper dive into that document, because what you'll find, I hope, is that the base plan actually does incorporate a lot of the goals of our folks that are looking for habitat preservation, and our folks that are hoping to sort of keep that balanced multi-use recreation. When we were looking at all the possible policies to consider for this in this endeavor and trying to separate them, most of them ended up coming in the base plan because we felt that they were not mutually exclusive and important for the future of the open space, that we felt we could do both and we could implement both. So while it seems that we are still far apart because we have these two other alternatives, those are sort of enhancements to the base plan, which already includes a lot of what we are hoping is coming together and consensus and about keeping our open space in good shape for the future.
And Austin, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, just have a couple quick comments. One thing that I think that we have to try to remember, and I know that this is the mindset that we all are thinking about bringing to these conversations, is that that we have to make decisions and make recommendations that are in the best interest of Belmont, not one vocal group versus another vocal group, right? So we have to take that information, listen to that information, incorporate that into our processes and the comments that we're making, but then ultimately make a decision, a recommendation that we think is best for everyone, not just the people that are talking all the time. So we need to continue to remember that. And then also just with, I think we've heard this comment a couple times today, and I think it's true that we do need to be as explicit as we can. I know Craig mentioned this, and pointing to specific definitions or being clearer in what this phrase or terminology might mean. And I think that's really important to try to do that. But at the same time, also remember that it's a really challenging balance when you're trying to sort of thread the needle of creating a document that'll live in perpetuity while explaining our specific position now and what our priorities were at this point in time, but then still allowing for flexibility for things that don't exist in the future, like e-bikes, for example, right? So I think that's an ongoing challenge that we have to try to remember that we're all trying to work towards, but don't get lost on that. Like there is a point in this too that we can't account for every possible outcome in the discussion and definitions of what we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you so much, Austin. I just want to thank everybody for participating today. I feel like we had an amazing conversation and got a lot of guidance and advice for the open space management plan. I just want to remind everybody that this information is available on the BelmontProsPlan.com website. This presentation, as well as the slides and recording, will be posted by the end of the week, so anybody can go back and re-listen or dig a little bit deeper into what was spoken about today. And as always, comments are welcome at info@BelmontProsPlan.com. We'd love to hear your input on the environmental assessment, base plan management alternatives, and the soon-to-be published recreation use assessment. So it's 9 o'clock. I just want to thank you all for your 2 hours that you've participated, and have a great rest of your evening.